So this year, as I was saying, this year has been a momentous one for us in Bangladesh, marking 50 years of our independence. And we've spent a lot of time over the past year and this month in particular, talking about the great strides Bangladesh has made in becoming the development miracle from Kissinger's infamous basket case. And of course, I don't want to downplay the achievements we've made, but it's truly saddening that 50 years later, we remain far from freeing ourselves from the tyranny, oppression, inequality, and authoritarianism that our forefathers and mothers have fought against. Although Bangladesh is set to be among the top 3 fastest growing economies in the world by 2022, it's also one of the most unequal economies. The number of ultra-wealthy people in Bangladesh increased faster than in any other country in the world between 2010 and 2019. And just 1% of our population holds over 16% of the total national income in 2021. So behind our success story lies a tragic but avoidable tale of poverty, unemployment, corruption, and curtailment of basic human rights. And while the government, the list of human rights violations is perhaps too long to go over in 5 minutes. So as a journalist, I'll focus on the shrinking space for dissent, which has shrunk dramatically over the past few years, both online and offline. Offline, we've seen increasingly intolerant attitudes of the government towards mass movements, including those initiated by the youth. Many of these protests have been met with violence, mass arrests, and on a few occasions, even deaths. Grave human rights violations by state agencies have continued unabated. There have been more than 2,400 incidents of extrajudicial killings since 2010, according to rights organization Ainu Shalish Kendro. Meanwhile, over 600 people have been forcibly disappeared, allegedly by security forces over the past decade. Of these, the majority were ultimately released or eventually were formally produced in court. But there has been no real investigation into what actually happened to these people and or how badly they were tortured in the period they went missing. However, the government has been super active in tracking down dissenters, activists, journalists, or even students online, particularly through the enactment and indiscriminate use of the Digital Security Act, which we call the DSA. The DSA essentially allows security agencies to pick up and arbitrarily detain anyone critical of the government or the ruling party over vague allegations of damaging the reputation of the state, or creating instability, and so on. There have been allegations of torture while being in interrogation in detention. Earlier this year, writer Mushtaq Ahmed, who was denied bail 6 times, died in jail, supposedly from a heart attack. He was picked up by paramilitary force RAB for Facebook posts criticizing the government's handling of COVID-19. He was in jail for 9 months without so much as a chance to see his family before he finally got out of jail in a coffin. Mushtaq's friend, cartoonist Ahmed Kabir Kishore, who was also arrested in the same case, insists that both of them were tortured in police custody. But of course, subsequent probes conducted by the jail authorities and the Home Ministry did not find any negligence on the part of the authorities. He just mysteriously died. And while the government has successfully clamped down on dissent on social media, it has not been equally successful in countering hate speech and fake news, particularly those targeting women, Hindu, Indigenous, and LGBTIQ communities. This year, during Durga Puja, Bangladesh witnessed one of the worst fates of communal violence in recent years, fueled by hate mongers on social media. Hundreds of Hindu homes were ravaged, over 120 temples and puja mandaps destroyed over a period of a week in over 21 districts across the country, in what now appears to have been a premeditated event. Days later, we saw that the violence spread to Tripura, only this time the victims were the Muslim community there. This is an example of how the whole region seems to be stuck in a loop where violence and hatred in one part fuels bigotry in another. With anti-Muslim sentiments in both India and Myanmar, our neighbors, it has been increasingly difficult in Bangladesh to counter the propaganda of Islamist groups. And of course, it hasn't helped that the current regime, which claims to be secular and pro-minority, has pandered to communal forces over the past decade, from arbitrarily removing non-Muslim writers from the school curriculum to recognizing Qawmi Madrasa degree as equivalent to masters, to essentially instituting blasphemy laws for hurting religious sentiments in the guise of the Digital Security Act. Across the region, we appear to have institutionalized hate and intolerance for other ideas and beliefs, and have created micro-fascists who feel entitled to not only tell others how to live their lives, but take increasingly violent means to impose their views on others. In fact, intolerance seems to be the only thing seeping through our borders, which for all intents and purposes remain as rigid, if not more, than the ones arbitrarily demarcated by our colonizers. Despite the fact that
Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, I'm almost done. As I was saying, our borders remain as rigid as the ones left demarcated by our colonizers. So just as an example, despite the fact that India and Bangladesh share friendly relations, since 2000, more than 1,000 Bangladeshis have been killed in border areas, according to rights defenders who describe the Indo-Bangla border as killing fields. An overwhelming majority of those killed are poor, unarmed villagers, mostly cattle rearers and fisherfolk. But the Indian authorities have not taken action for unjustified lethal force against the perpetrators. So in the face of growing jingoism and hatred and intolerance, I think it's really important that we get together and put our nation states and hold our nation states accountable. I can only hope that what we're proposing here can be a start to that long fight. Thanks.
Yeah, fingers crossed, Shweta.